Hi everyone, welcome to our resting metabolic rate lab. What we'll get to discover today and go over and cover is bioenergetics, and that's just another way of saying how our biology or cells can generate energy for us. And ultimately, that helps explain what metabolism is and what's involved in that. Then we'll look into something called a respiration ratio or respiration exchange ratio or respiratory quotient. It's all interchangeable terms for the same thing, and how that relates to fuel. So the food we eat and the nutrition that our body will use from our bioenergetics or cellular metabolism to figure out what the respiratory exchange ratio is and what that means for us. And then lastly but not least, we get into the equipment side of things. You'll need to know that for your lab when you go through it, and some of the videos that we have set out for you there. So without further ado, let's dive into it. Bioenergetics, metabolism. So metabolism, most of you might intuitively know what it is, just generally from everyday knowledge when you're talking about health and fitness, in particular weight management, weight loss, and that side of things. It's, you kind of probably have a conception that it's something to do with calories, and sure enough, when you're talking about resting metabolic rate or the total energy expenditure in a day, your metabolic rate is comprised of how many calories you expend in a day. So, I mentioned a lot of terms there, but let's step back and take a look at what they all kind of mean. So, in a nutshell, and in its fundamental base level, metabolism is taking food in for energy, so what we need to eat, and that turns into some energy if it's macronutrients, and sometimes, but not always, oxygen gets put into our cells. Our cells use that with its internal machinery, and what we get in the end afterwards is water, carbon dioxide as byproducts, but most importantly, something called ATP. Before we move forward in explaining more what ATP is, a simple, brief overview. So food can get broken down into usable forms of energy, and that's from carbohydrates, fats, proteins can be used for food energy. It's called a macronutrient because of that, but due to a small amount of energy typically coming from protein, unless you're in a starving state or significantly fasted, typically you're going to be utilizing carbohydrates or fats. And so what that looks like in our body is it's either called glucose, so carbohydrates get turned into glucose or simple sugars, or stored in the muscle as glycogen, or it's also our food energy from fats is turned into something called free fatty acids. So you can note that under the bioenergetics metabolism side, where food gets broken down into those, and then the cells bring them in. Now, we'll get into the difference a little bit later for your last two labs, but the cell can undergo cellular metabolism, which is creating energy for the body to use. That's essentially what metabolism is, taking food, making energy, and it can do that with oxygen or without. And we'll see the differences a little bit later in this lab, and then how that applies to performance and activity later on in your last two labs. So, well, just focusing on ATP here as we carry forward onto the next slide. ATP is called adenosine triphosphate. Okay, adenosine triphosphate, and more or less it converts back and forth between adenosine triphosphate, and adenosine diphosphate. So tri being 3, 2 being, or di being 2. And you can see that in this diagram here. If we start at the top, it uses the analogy of a battery. So we have this molecule that's more or less stored energy. So it's a fairly good analogy. Oftentimes you'll hear it referred to as energy currency that the body can use. So we have this ATP, we add some water, and it becomes hydrolyzed and releases energy. So what happens when that little phosphate molecule on the end of ATP comes apart, that chemical bond gets broken. And when that bond gets broken, energy gets released, okay? And that energy is released, the cell somewhere in our body uses that to do work, some sort of work, whether it's exercise or building more proteins in our body, or other things that require energy to live. So again, once that phosphate comes off, it releases energy. So that's great. But the nice thing about this molecule is we can recycle. So we can take energy from our food stores typically and put it back into this molecule and store it in that bond. So again, when we go from a di to a triphosphate, or 2 to 3 phosphates on this group, it needs to take in energy. So it becomes a stored, like a battery that's fully charged again. Okay? And so that's how our body actually uses energy day to day. And so we'll move on now to resting metabolic rate. And what that is, it's the amount of energy that your body uses at rest in a wakeful state. So ultimately, if you laid around, did nothing all day, ate nothing, didn't exercise, just stayed and put, maybe, for example, it being in the hospital and in bed rest, this would be it. This would be the amount of energy your body uses. Total energy expenditure, on the other hand, has your resting metabolic rate plus all the energy that your body and cells use to live, to do more than just living. So for example, eating and digesting takes some energy, exercise takes energy, just walking around, physical activity takes up energy that you use. So that would be everything that you need to go about your day. Whereas if you're just talking about your metabolism, that's just the process of taking food and converting it to energy. So when we're talking about that equation, and I'm going to skip back here, when we're talking about this equation, again, you'll notice on the bottom, typically we have oxygen in the air, on the one hand, used in cellular metabolism, and carbon dioxide on the other side. And again, whether we use oxygen or not depends on whether we're having aerobic, so with air, or anaerobic, without oxygen, to have cellular respiration. And that depends largely on intensity of exercise and what we've been eating. And so the demands of our body typically have a large play on that. But based off of this, we can generate something called a respiratory exchange ratio, or respiratory quotient. When you're looking your labs, it's going to say RQ rather than RER, but they're the same thing. And what that is at the end of the day is the volume of carbon dioxide over the volume of oxygen that we breathe out. So when we breathe out, that's called expired air. It's not air after being dead or pass away. It's literally used air, or our breath when we breathe out. And the reason for this is, again, that equation. We know what's coming in. We know the atmosphere has a certain fixed amount of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen in it, as well as some other gases. Nitrogen is innate, and we don't use that in our respiration, so that doesn't really matter. What does matter? Oxygen and carbon dioxide. And again, the reason going back here is we know when cellular metabolism has occurred to a certain degree, we get carbon dioxide. And so again, that's that volume of carbon dioxide over oxygen. And what we can do is, again, we get a ratio. So ratios are percentages or fractions. And when we're speaking about just oxidizing carbohydrates, so a glucose molecule, we get this top function here. And if you use what's called stoichiometry or from chemistry, we can look molecule per molecule how this reaction occurs. And what we can see is for every 1 glucose, we need 6 oxygens to react to create energy. See, we can see 38 ATP over here from a glucose molecule. And so when we look at the volume, the amount of carbon dioxide to oxygen, we see ultimately for every 6 carbon dioxide we get 6 oxygen. So that's 6 over 6, which equals 1. Okay. Oxidization of fatty acid or free fatty acid, which is what fats turn into when we use it for energy in our body. We can see that for every 1 fatty acid, we need 23 oxygen in order to react through cellular metabolism. So that's the difference between anaerobic up at the top and aerobic down on the bottom. So using oxygen, we can see how much oxygen we need, significantly more. And when we do that, we get tons of ATP. Okay, we get 129 ATP for every 1 molecule of fat. And again, when we look at the exchange ratio, we notice this time though that oxygen appears to be greater than carbon dioxide in our breath out. Okay? And so when we're looking at the respiratory exchange ratios, when we see 1 or closer to 1, we know that we're using more carbohydrates for fuel. On the other hand, when we see it closer to 0.7, we know we're getting closer to fat utilization or pure fat utilization. And you'll see this chart in your lab. So it's going to be laid out for you from 0 to 100% fat use or carb use, and you'll notice they switch. Okay. So how do we figure this out? You can't just catch air as someone breathes out, right? Well, you kind of can, and it's through a piece of equipment called a metabolic cart. Okay. So typically, you'll see that this is the cart itself. So there's a computer set up to analyze through a gas analyzer that is calibrated and collects a bunch of information. I usually set this up before in-person labs. And then you get this very fun, you can see our very happy volunteer here with something called a Hans Rudolph mouthpiece. And so again, in the tutorial labs and the videos and stuff, you'll see this a little bit more explained and three-dimensional for you. But ultimately, this mouthpiece is like a snorkel. So and it's set up where this side, air can be breathed in, and there's a valve here, so air can only get into this little center chamber here by the arrows. Then inspired, so inspired or inspiration or inspired air means breathing in. Exhale or exhalation or expired air is on the way out, and the reason it doesn't go back out this way is there's that one-way valve, so air can only come in, and there's another one-way valve where only air can leave through this direction. So we kind of catch the person's breath out, gets shot in, we see their nose is plugged, so we know air is not getting out that way. It goes through this big, long, clear, vacuum-like hose, which you can see the red arrow kind of pointing to here, and then goes through the gas analysis chamber, which compares it to the atmosphere. So the machine knows what the air is like here, percentage of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So it knows what it is out here in the blue before it's breathed in. Once inspiration occurs, cellular metabolism happens, however it does, and then we get expired air captured by the machine, and then it analyzes it. Yeah, and that's essentially how metabolism in the metabolic cart works is through your breath. And again, the volume of carbon dioxide over the volume of oxygen. And through that we can infer a lot of things, as you'll see in your lab. Okay, well, best of luck with the labs. Hope you have fun tracking things through and enjoying our discussion.